Let's talk about making full fisherman's rib using the silver reed family of machines, which includes Japanese Singer, silver reed, and Piesel, and Studio, possibly some others that I'm forgetting. These all function about the same. I'm demonstrating on an SK840 with an SRP60 ribber, and if you were to look in the manual, you would think that you could not do full fisherman's rib. That's because there's not something called that in the manual. The SRP50 manual names it double English rib, which is the same stitch, but the SRP60 manual omits it. So you need to know two things. Double English rib is a synonym for full fisherman's rib, first of all, and the manual may leave it out, but the SRP60 will perform it just fine. That's what I'll be demonstrating on. So what exactly is the stitch and why would you use it? Here is what it looks like, and both faces of the fabric look just the same. So it's completely reversible, and it is much, much thicker and bulkier than most stitches would be on the same machine. Also, it does not roll at all. So that's one good reason to use it, is for non-rolling fabrics that are warm, such as scarves. Another reason to use it is that this is in fact a double bed tuck stitch fabric, which can make a very, very wide piece of fabric, depending on the yarn and stitch size used, sometimes up to 6 feet wide. These symbols in the instruction chart are telling you that both beds are tucking. In my book, More Merry, I created some circle sweaters, and some of them rely on half fisherman's rib to make the circular shape of the garment without any fuss or having to transfer stitches. In half fisherman's rib, one bed tucks every other row and knits every other row. The other bed knits stockinette the whole time. And as you can see here, that makes it much, much wider than the adjoining stockinette fabric. This makes the More Merry sweaters surprisingly easy to knit, and in case they interest you, I'll put a link to the book in the program notes. So what's full fisherman's rib? In full fisherman's rib, both beds get into the tucking action. Alternately, each bed knits a row and tucks the second row. If the main bed knits going right to left, it will tuck going left to right, and the ribber bed will take its turn knitting. It will be tucking while the main bed is knitting. Here I'm knitting with Yeoman Cashmelon. This is the thickest yarn that I can knit full needle, full fisherman's rib with. We could also be alternating needles, be in the every other needle ribbing setup, and knit more easily. Also knit with larger yarn. But for maximum fabric width, we want the full needle rib setup. Now I will change to the dark red yarn, which is Tam Astracryl 3-ply. It's a little bit thinner and it knits much more easily. In former times, this would have been called a light fingering weight yarn. Nowadays, it's known as number 1. And this, or something even lighter, such as 0 weight, otherwise known as lace weight, is ideal for standard gauge, full needle, full fisherman rib. For this summer shawl, I used the full needle, full fisherman's rib stitch. In this case, I stacked 3 yarns, industrial thin yarn that added up to the weight of a number 1 yarn. And they make a lovely tweed and then create the shape with no actual transferring or changing the number of stitches whatsoever. The wide part of the dimension of the shawl is simply caused by changing from knit 1 purl 1 ribbing for the tails to full needle rib for the transition, and then to full fisherman's rib on the full needle rib setup for the body of the shawl, making the wide area that surrounds the shoulders and back. This pattern will probably appear in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views sometime in the middle of 2022. I prefer the standard gauge version, but I included quite a lot of gauges so as to include every knitting machine and every knitter that I possibly could. But you do need 2 fully functioning beds. This cannot be done on a single bed machine in any practical way. The needles have to alternate, so we'll use this setup with them at half pitch if we're using every needle on both beds. But we can use pitch where they would naturally oppose and select every other needle if we are using the 1x1 needle setup. For some patterns, you might actually want both end stitches on the main bed, and if so, you would add another needle to work on the right-hand edge here. That's not what the manual recommends, but I have found that you can usually get by with it if you use sufficient weights, especially adding weights to the edges of the work. That's where your 7 wires come in handy, or my preference is actually to use the heavy forks from my Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools book. In fact, for these machines, edge weights are an enormous help just to knit full fisherman's rib anytime. In the manual, we're looking for double English rib, and it's on page 29. And that's if you have an SRP 50 manual. You won't find it in the SRP 60 manual. Here's what it means in real life. I am starting at stockinette settings because I was starting with regular ribbing. And to begin knitting full fisherman's rib, I change these things. The dial rotates over to the tuck position, and this lever must be in the forward position. These are the main bed changes. On the ribber carriage, I had things set up like this and need to change them so that 0 is showing in this window, and this lever slides over to the tuck position. You probably already know that individual machines vary a bit, but just for reference, I used 5 plus 2 clicks on the dial of both the main bed and the ribber bed and got this nicely balanced fabric. In this photo, you can see the full fisherman's rib transitioning to just plain full needle rib. There's no change in stitch size, but the fabric suddenly got immensely wider. Just a couple more tips before I send you off to try knitting on your own. This is a challenging stitch for the machine. Therefore, it is where a sponge bar that is wearing out or an imperfect needle will show up first. Also, if you've got a little bit of crud or uncleanliness in either carriage, you may want to clean and oil a little bit for the best results. The sweater that I'm wearing while knitting, and it shows up a little bit in the video, is this one, and I actually designed it and made it last summer for knitting looms. But I've enjoyed it so much this winter that I am going to work on a machine knitted version for bulky machines. So you can look forward to that in the future.